The first cry for help was ignored. The second was silenced. The third, it changed everything. No one listened when she first spoke, a whisper against the weight of a world that did not want to hear. She was 16, a girl with wide, searching eyes and a secret too heavy for her fragile frame. She went to her mother first, hands shaking, voice barely above a breath. But the moment the words left her lips, she saw it, the flicker of something dark in her mother's eyes. Not disbelief, not even shock, just fear. A quiet, smothering fear that made her mother's face harden, her mouth press into a thin, unyielding line. "We will never speak of this again," she said. And that was the end of it. But silence is a heavy thing, and secrets have a way of suffocating those who keep them. She tried again. This time, a friend. Someone who had known her since childhood, who had shared in her laughter and her tears. But as soon as she said his name, the revered man, the priest who had guided their prayers, blessed their meals, offered them salvation, the air between them changed. Her friend pulled away, her face clouding with something close to disgust. "That's impossible," she said. "You must have misunderstood something." Misunderstood. A sickness twisted in her stomach. How do you misunderstand the weight of a man pressing down on you? The way his breath lingers, the whispered words of power dressed in scripture. How do you misunderstand the way your own body betrays you? How the impossible becomes undeniable as the months pass, and your stomach swells with something you never asked for? She was running out of people to tell. But still, she tried one last time. She went to the church, to the place where the whispers of the divine were supposed to drown out the filth of the world. She stood before them, her hands trembling, her heart a wild thing caged in her chest, and she told them. The silence that followed was deep, hollow, an abyss in which she was drowning. Then the murmurs started, soft at first, then louder, rising into something she could not control. Lies, deception, a desperate girl seeking attention. Did she not realize who he was? A man of God, a chosen one. How dare she stain his name with such filth? They did not ask for proof. They did not seek the truth. The truth was inconvenient. It disrupted their order, threatened their faith, unraveled the very fabric of the world they had chosen to believe in. So they turned their backs on her, and just like that, she ceased to exist. But secrets do not stay buried forever. And some truths, no matter how deeply hidden, have a way of clawing their way to the surface. The divine and the diabolical are not always separate forces. Sometimes, they are two faces of the same entity, flickering like a flame caught in the wind, shifting, merging, indistinguishable. In the oldest African folk tales, there are spirits who wear the skins of men, walking among the faithful, whispering words that sound like salvation, but lead only to ruin. They are tricksters, deceivers, creatures who feed on reverence, growing stronger with every bowed head and every whispered prayer. She had once believed in the man who stood at the pulpit, draped in the robes of holiness. He spoke of purity, of obedience, of surrendering oneself entirely to the will of God. His voice was a river, smooth and deep, washing over the congregation, cleansing them of their doubts, filling the spaces where fear once lived with the comfort of certainty. But faith is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. She remembers the first time she felt it, the unsettling weight of his gaze, the way his words stretched too long in the air when he spoke to her. He never touched her, not at first. But there was something in his presence, something unseen, yet suffocating, as though she had been marked long before she understood what it meant to be chosen. "Obedience," he had said one evening, his voice soft but unyielding. "That is the highest virtue. When we resist God's plan. And who are we to question the will of the divine?" The words burrowed deep into her, like a seed planted in the dark. At 16, she did not yet understand the nature of manipulation, the slow erosion of self under the weight of someone else's will. He did not demand her trust. He built it. He shaped it with careful hands, pressing his fingerprints into the fragile clay of her mind, until she could no longer tell where her faith ended and his control began. It was not sudden. That would have been too obvious. No. It was slow, insidious, a look held too long, a touch that lingered just a moment more than it should have, words spoken with too much tenderness, disguised as concern, as guidance. By the time she realized what was happening, she was already caught in the web. And when it happened, when he crossed the final boundary, when his hands became chains and his voice a prison, she did not fight. Not because she did not want to, but because she had been taught that obedience was holy. She had been taught that resistance was sin. And so, she let it happen. But when the weight of it settled over her in the weeks that followed, something inside her cracked. She could feel it, like a hairline fracture running through her soul. She wanted to scream, to claw at her skin until she could tear the shame away, but there was nowhere to run. Because where do you go when the monster wears the face of God? She tried to confide in the congregation, in the people who had known her since she was a child, who had seen her grow under the same roof where they knelt and prayed. But their eyes were blank, their expressions unreadable, as though she had spoken in a language they did not understand. "You must be mistaken," they told her. But she wasn't. "You shouldn't speak of such things." But she had to. "That man has devoted his life to God. Do you think you know better than him?" And just like that, the silence swallowed her whole. It was not the first time a sacred voice had been used to mask the unspeakable. It was not the first time holiness had been weaponized against the innocent. The history of faith is a history of power, and power is never without corruption. In some African traditions, there are stories of priests who claim their wisdom is granted by the spirits, yet their rituals demand the suffering of the powerless. There are stories of village elders who speak of divine judgment, yet use it as a shield for their own cruelty. There are stories of gods who promise justice, but only for those who kneel without question. The deception is always the same. Divinity is the ultimate authority. And where there is authority, there is control. And where there is control, there is silence. In the Western world, the deception wears different robes, but follows the same design. The Church has been a sanctuary for the faithful, but it has also been a fortress for those who seek power. From the Vatican to the smallest village parishes, the stories are whispered but rarely spoken aloud. Stories of men who wear the cloth of the sacred, yet prey upon the weak. Stories of those who have been buried, not in the ground, but beneath centuries of silence. For centuries, figures of faith have wielded the fear of the divine like a blade. In the name of salvation, they have justified suffering. In the name of obedience, they have demanded submission. And when the truth threatens to rise, they have called it blasphemy and cast it into the dark. And yet the truth does not die. It lingers, waiting for the moment when someone is brave enough to give it voice. But bravery comes at a cost. She learned this when she spoke out, when she dared to tell the story that no one wanted to hear. She learned it when she became a pariah, a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when one questions the authority of the divine. But in the quiet of her own mind, she held on to something no one could take from her. She knew what had happened. She knew what he was. And she knew that one day, the weight of all the silenced voices would become too great to bear, and the truth would rise. Because in every tale of deception, there comes a moment of reckoning, and even the most sacred masks cannot hide the face of darkness forever. The whispers began long before she spoke, soft, elusive, winding through the village like the breath of spirits long forgotten. Women with knowing eyes exchanged glances when she passed. Old men muttered under their breath, their voices carrying something heavier than words. The elders sat in silence, their faces carved from stone, watching, always watching. At first, she thought it was shame that followed her, the stain of a scandal no one would name aloud, the weight of a secret she had tried to bury, only to find that it had already spread, taking root in places she had never been. But shame does not make the air hum with unspoken truths. Shame does not draw the gaze of those who once ignored you. does not summon the wary eyes of strangers, does not make the oldest woman in the village stop her in the market, place a wrinkled hand over her stomach, and whisper, "This was not supposed to happen. Not yet." The words clung to her skin like smoke, curling around her thoughts, seeping into the fractures of her mind. Not yet. As if it was inevitable. As if it had always been written. As if this child, this unwanted consequence of a crime no one would acknowledge, was something more than it seemed. That night, sleep refused to claim her. Her body ached, heavy with exhaustion, but her thoughts refused to be still. The old woman's voice echoed in the spaces between her breath, looping over and over like an incantation. Not yet. When she could take the silence no longer, she went looking for answers. The elder woman lived at the edge of the village, where the trees grew thick and the shadows stretched long into the night. Some called her a healer, others a witch. None dared to speak against her, for her knowledge was older than memory itself. She had seen things others had not. She had heard the stories passed down before the world forgot what they meant, and she knew. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering patterns against the walls. The elder did not look up when she entered, as if she had been expecting her, as if the future had already whispered its secrets into her ear. "You carry something that does not belong to you," the elder said, her voice quiet but heavy with certainty. "Something placed." A chill ran down her spine. "Placed?" she echoed, barely recognizing her own voice. The elder finally looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, as if she were no longer just a girl, no longer just a victim, but a piece of something far greater than she had ever understood. "Not all children are born from flesh alone," the elder murmured. "Some are chosen, some are called, and some are given." She wanted to laugh, wanted to reject the absurdity of it all, but she could not, because deep inside, beneath the layers of fear and pain and disbelief, something inside her knew that this was no ordinary pregnancy, knew that the night she had tried so hard to forget had been more than just violence, knew that the weight in her womb was not just a child, but something else, something waiting. "Who did this?" she whispered. "Why?" The elder leaned forward, her eyes like embers in the firelight. "There are forces older than time," she said. "Forces that move unseen, shaping the fates of those who do not even know they are being played. Some bloodlines are not meant to end. Some lineages are written in prophecy." The world tilted beneath her feet. Prophecy. The word clawed at her mind, unraveling the fabric of her reality, forcing her to see beyond what she had been told. She had thought herself a victim of cruelty, a pawn in the hands of a man who had stolen something from her. But what if he had not acted alone? What if he had been merely an instrument, a tool for something greater, something beyond his own understanding? There were stories, whispered in the darkest hours of the night, of children born from unnatural unions. Children who carried within them the power of the ancestors, the will of the spirits. Some were saviors, others were destroyers, but all of them were chosen. The child inside her kicked, and for the first time she felt it. Not just movement, not just life, but something else. A presence. She had spent so long thinking of this child as an extension of him, a consequence of his sin. But now she wasn't sure. Because this was not just his doing. This was something else entirely. And deep down, she was beginning to fear that the child she carried had never belonged to her at all. The dreams began as whispers, curling through the edges of her mind, seeping into the spaces where fear lived. At first, they were fleeting, shadows shifting in the periphery of her thoughts, voices too distant to understand. But as the child inside her grew, so did the visions. They came to her in the dead of night, when silence stretched thin and the weight of the unseen pressed heavy against her chest. She would wake with a start, gasping for breath, her skin damp, her pulse thrumming like the drumbeats of an ancient ritual. And always, the same images would remain, burned into the back of her mind like a prophecy she did not yet understand. Figures shrouded in darkness, their faces hidden behind masks carved from bone. A circle of bodies swaying in rhythm, their feet pounding against the earth as their voices rose in a chant that did not belong to any language she had ever known. The air thick with something that was neither smoke nor mist, but something else entirely. Something alive, something watching. And then, always, the final vision. A child, standing alone in the center of it all. Silent. Still. And yet, the very ground beneath them seemed to pulse, to tremble, to breathe. The dreams did not fade with the morning light. They clung to her, lingered beneath her skin like an itch that could not be scratched. The child inside her stirred, and with every movement she felt it, an energy that was not her own, something ancient and unknowable pressing against the walls of her reality. She had heard the stories before, in hushed voices around the village fires, stories of children born beneath strange moons, of mothers who claimed their unborn spoke to them in dreams. Some were called blessings. Others were called omens. But all of them were feared. There were tales of infants born with eyes too knowing, with shadows that stretched too far, with whispers that carried across empty rooms. Some were said to be touched by the spirits, vessels for something greater than human understanding. Some brought great prosperity to their people. Others brought ruin. And then, there were the stories no one wanted to speak of. The ones where the child was not a child at all, where something else had taken root within the womb. Something that did not belong in this world. The elders said these children should never be allowed to take their first breath. She tried to dismiss it, to convince herself that this was nothing more than fear twisting her mind. But with every passing day, the truth became harder to deny. She was not alone in her own body. The presence inside her was more than flesh and bone, more than blood and breath. It was waiting. She could feel it, pressing against her thoughts, filling the spaces between them with something she could not name. The air around her felt charged, crackling with unseen energy, bending to the will of something she could not understand. And then there were the things that could not be ignored. Objects moving when she had not touched them. Candles flickering to life in a room with no wind. The way people glanced at her with something more than pity, something closer to fear. She was changing. Or perhaps she was simply becoming what she had always been. The elders knew. She could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at her stomach with a mixture of reverence and unease. They did not ask about the father. They did not speak of what had happened. Because maybe, in the depths of their wisdom, they had already seen the truth. This was not just about her suffering. This was not just about a crime committed in the dark. Something larger was at play. Something older than the man who had done this to her. Older than the church that had turned its back on her. Older than the world she had known. And she did not know if she should be afraid, or if it was already too late. The room was silent, yet the air carried the weight of something unspoken. She stood before him, her body trembling, her breath shallow, her hands curled into fists at her sides. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed the words she would say, the questions she would demand answers to. But now that she was here, standing in the presence of the man who had shattered her world, the words refused to come. He did not look surprised to see her. If anything, he seemed expectant. As if he had known this confrontation would come. As if he had been waiting. You were never meant to know. His voice was calm, eerily so. There was no fear, no hesitation, no guilt. Only certainty. Something inside her twisted at those words. Never meant to know. A chill ran through her veins, coiling itself around her bones, wrapping itself around every thought she had clung to for stability. She had come seeking justice, retribution, even an admission of guilt. But this was something else. This was the answer to a question she had not yet known to ask. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. "What do you mean?" she whispered. He exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words with care. "You think you are the first," he said, almost pitying. But you are not the first. The meaning of those words crashed over her like a wave, pulling her into the undertow. She had spent months believing she was alone in her suffering, the victim of a man who had betrayed his sacred vows. But the way he spoke now, this was not the guilt of a sinner. This was something colder, something calculated. This was a ritual. Her stomach clenched, nausea rising in her throat. How many? Her voice was hoarse, barely a breath. He tilted his head slightly as if the number was inconsequential. Enough. Enough. She wanted to scream, wanted to lunge at him, to claw at his face, to shake him until the truth spilled from his lips like blood. But she couldn't move, because the truth had already begun to take shape. She was not the first. There had been others. Others who had carried children they had not asked for. Others who had been told to stay silent. Others who had vanished into the depths of history, erased from existence as if they had never been. And the worst part, the part that made her skin crawl, that made the air feel thick with something she could not name, was the realization that none of this had happened by accident. It had been deliberate, planned. She pressed a hand to her stomach, as if she could shield the child growing inside her from the truth. But the truth had already wrapped itself around her, dragging her down into the depths of something far darker than she had ever imagined. This was not just about her. This was about blood. Sacred bloodlines, hidden lineages, names that had been struck from the records, births that had been wiped from history. Why? The question was barely a whisper. He watched her for a long moment, as if debating whether she was ready to hear the answer. And then finally, he spoke. Because some blood must be preserved, and some must be controlled. The words sent a shudder through her spine. Blood. The word carried weight, meaning. She had heard the stories before, of rulers who traced their ancestry back to gods, of families who claimed divine right through unbroken lineage. In some African traditions, kings were not merely chosen, they were born, their bloodlines shaped by prophecy and preserved through careful selection. And in the Western world, history was no different. The Vatican's hidden archives, the royal bloodlines of Europe, woven together through centuries of arranged marriages. The whispered theories of secret societies that had guided the course of history from the shadows, ensuring that power remained in the hands of those deemed worthy. It was not about faith. It was about control. And now, she understood. She was not simply a victim. She was a vessel. The child inside her, this life she had never wanted, never asked for, was not the result of chance. It was the continuation of something older than she could comprehend. She staggered back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. No, she murmured. You're lying. He smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. You already know the truth, he said. You feel it. You've always felt it. Her hands clenched into fists, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to deny it, to reject it outright. But deep inside, something whispered that he was right. The dreams, the visions, the way the world seemed to shift around her, as if bending to a force beyond her control. She had not simply been chosen. She had been created. Her entire existence had been part of a plan she had never been given the choice to accept or reject. She thought of the others, the women who had come before her, whose names had been erased. Had they fought? Had they tried to run? Or had they simply been swallowed by the weight of it all, consumed by the knowledge that no matter how far they went, the blood that ran through their veins would never truly belong to them? She met his gaze, her jaw tightening. Where are they? She demanded. The smile faded from his lips. For the first time, a shadow flickered across his expression. Gone. That was the unspoken answer. And if she did not find a way to break the cycle, she would be next. Her breath came fast, ragged, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged thing desperate for escape. She had spent so long searching for answers, convinced that knowing the truth would set her free. But the truth had only given her another prison. The only question now was whether she would let it consume her, or whether she would find a way to shatter it once and for all. She stood at the threshold of truth, a place from which there was no return. The weight of what she knew pressed against her chest, filling her lungs with the suffocating realization that knowledge was not freedom. Knowledge was a burden. Knowledge was a sentence. For weeks, she had wrestled with the enormity of it all, the deception woven so intricately into the fabric of faith, the silent lineage that pulsed beneath history like an unseen river, the hidden children whose existence had been erased before they could leave a mark upon the world. She was not the first, and she would not be the last. And yet, standing here, knowing what she knew, she felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. She had seen the faces of those who pretended not to know, those who whispered in hushed voices yet averted their eyes when she passed. Fear was stronger than justice. Silence was safer than truth. This was how the cycle continued, unbroken, protected by the very people it oppressed. But she could not be silent. The thought of letting this story vanish, like the others before her, turned her stomach. If she said nothing, the machine would keep turning, its gears grinding through generations, its purpose uninterrupted. Someone else would come after her, another girl, another vessel, another nameless offering to a power older than understanding. She had spent too much time thinking that truth was enough, that simply speaking would be enough. But truth was a dangerous thing. Truth did not set people free. It shattered them. Would they listen? Would they believe? Did it matter? Belief had never been about truth. Belief was about what people were willing to accept, and what she had uncovered. What had been done to her, what had been done to the others before her, was not something people would willingly accept. To accept it would be to dismantle everything. The foundation of faith, the illusion of purity, the righteousness of those who claimed to lead. If the people believed her, they would have to question everything. Their prayers, their gods, the very structure of power that governed their lives. Most would rather be blind. She had seen it before, in the stories whispered through generations. The griots, the keepers of history, spoke of those who had glimpsed forbidden truths and paid the price. The wanderer who stepped too close to the sacred grove and was never seen again. The child who listened to the whispers of the spirits and had their name wiped from memory. The elder who spoke against the king and was swallowed by the river, as if he had never existed at all. Truth was a double-edged sword. Those who wielded it rarely emerged unscathed. And so, she had to ask herself, was it worth it? She could vanish. She could slip into the shadows like the others before her. Let the world forget her. Let history write her out of existence. It would be easy. A quiet death. A disappearance that would mean nothing to anyone but herself. Or she could speak, and she would not go quietly. She had seen what silence did. It swallowed people whole, erased their suffering, smoothed the edges of reality, until only the lie remained. But she would not let herself be erased. She had been born into this story, without her consent. But she would not let them dictate how it ended. When she walked into the gathering hall, the air grew still. Faces turned, eyes narrowing with suspicion. They knew she had been broken, that she had been touched by something that should have remained hidden. But they did not yet know what she had become. She stood before them, her voice steady, her heart pounding against her ribs. You will listen. A murmur rippled through the room, discontent spreading like a wave. But she did not falter. You will listen, because you have spent your lives pretending not to hear. She told them. Every detail. The deception, the lineage, the bloodlines preserved and controlled. The way power had been passed through generations like a sacred relic, protected by silence, sealed by fear. Some gasped. Some shook their heads, unwilling to let the words touch them. She saw the moment denial took root. This is blasphemy. She lies. She is lost. She had expected this. She had known that the truth would not be welcomed. She had known that the moment she spoke, She had made herself a target. "You can call it a lie," she said, "but that does not make it any less true." Silence. She saw doubt creeping into the faces before her. Some shifting uncomfortably, others gripping their robes as though holding onto something tangible would keep the ground from shifting beneath them. And then, a voice from the back of the room. "What do you want from us?" The question was laced with exhaustion, with the weight of too many stories buried beneath too many years. She could tell them to rise up. She could demand justice. But justice was not something given freely. It was taken. It was fought for. What she wanted was for them to see. "Tell me," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, "how many stories like mine have you already buried?" No one answered. "How many names have been forgotten? How many children were taken? How many truths did you silence because they were too inconvenient to accept?" The room was heavy with the weight of what could no longer be unsaid. She saw it in their faces, the war waging inside them. Some would fight to keep the illusion alive. Some would turn away, pretending this had never happened. But some had begun to see. She had planted the seed. What they did with it was no longer in her hands. She turned, walking away, knowing she had done what she came to do. The night was thick with uncertainty, the world teetering between what had been and what could be. Would they listen? Would they act? Or would the silence swallow them once more? She did not know. But she knew one thing. Truth, once spoken, could not be unheard. And no matter what they did to bury it, it would find a way to rise. The most dangerous truths are not the ones that are lost, but the ones that are hidden in plain sight. The ones whispered in the dark, woven into history, disguised as myths and buried beneath centuries of silence. They do not vanish. They wait. Some will hear this story and dismiss it, brushing it aside as fiction, a fabrication too impossible to be real. Others will feel a shift deep within them, an unease they cannot name, a question they dare not ask. How many stories like this have been silenced? How many voices erased? How many truths have been hidden, not because they were lost, but because they were never meant to be found? Perhaps the real question is not whether these stories exist, but whether we are willing to see them. Whether we are ready to acknowledge that the world we know is merely a shadow of something far deeper, far older, far more unsettling than we ever imagined. And if we dare to look closer, to listen, to question, what might we uncover? Or perhaps it is safer not to ask.